Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Now, 8.2.5 has just launched, and if you're a Sylvanas loyalist, shout out to you guys. On to that one. The cinematics were great, but here today, we're not going to talk quite about the cinematics or the lore implications or anything like that, although they are pretty interesting. But instead, we're going to start talking about what wasn't in 8.2.5, and it was class changes. And there are some class changes that we'd really love to be able to see and hopefully look for in the future. So, in our previous video, we talked about it, the toxic healer meta for Eternal Palace, and some of the reasoning and issues behind what is wrong with healing right now. And with that being said, it's kind of a surprise that we haven't seen much class changes to help resolve it, but based off of where we've seen class design this expansion, they're not really focusing super hard on making sweeping changes. So the topic today is going to talk about the two parts of how they can start fixing this healer meta by making some more light changes to different class abilities, some existing abilities without too much upheaval, and also looking at the dungeons, the raids themselves, how they can start changing how the classes are going to start working as well. So from Eternal Palace, there was a number of fights with incredibly scripted events in terms of the damage that was incoming. A lot of them were very fun to heal, but some other ones just made you feel like you were waiting for the next mechanic and the spell queuing that would follow. Zakul and Queen's Court really come to mind on that one, because it's so scripted, it's so straightforward as to what you have to do, and while Zakul has some horrifying spell queuing issues, Queen's Court on the other hand, you're just waiting for that combination of abilities to come out. You know, you're punished for popping multiple sparks at once, but you're always comboing sparks with other deadly abilities. You'll have deferred sentence on top of a spark. You'll have form ranks on top of sparks coming out, and that is very easy to deal lethal amounts of damage, but also as a healer, you're just focusing on building up your defensive cooldowns, your raid cooldowns for very specific moments, targeting those, accomplishing that, and then you're DPSing, and then you're waiting for that next combination. Because it stands right now, healers have such power relative to health pools, meaning that they don't have so much stamina that's a struggle to top off the health pool. It's much better than it was at the end of Legion, where I just hit a good Light's Wrath and I bring everybody from 20% to 100% in a second. Thank you, Velens. But it's still to the point where other healers that don't bring that kind of burst payload are just constantly tossed to the wayside. Double Disc, double Paladin dominating the Eternal Palace, and if nothing changes, both in the raid side and in class change side, we might just see that again. So from a raid perspective, they need to look at how stamina is going to increase to a sufficient level that they can make boss mechanics be threatening, deadly, but also be able to have sustained HPS required. If they start looking at more logs and more data from the Eternal Palace, there's too many encounters that are just focused on big bursts of damage. Orgazoa was a very fun fight on progression because it was a 5 heal encounter and continually just ramped up into disaster, right? You start using some of your cooldowns very early on just to make sure that they're rolling, make sure they're cycling, but then you get to the point where you're kind of just trying to save mana until the very end where everything is just massive damage, and that's pretty fun. And it also requires a good diversity of healers, and it also makes it so that there's not a lot of breathing room for healers to add more damage unless they do it passively. So going into this, Paladin through Wings, and then Disciplined Priests just through their own damage by dealing with Atonement, have had such great passive DPS that the other healers are just tossed to the wayside, even if they're actively contributing DPS. And that's kind of a problem, because it starts costing them healing uptime before they do it. So when we're looking at these bosses, yes, it's great to be able to have Titan Rage Timers, but they also have this challenge, really, where they have to balance it with requiring healers to heal enough, and then having either moments early on in a fight before things get out of control where they can start adding that passive damage, some quick globals that they'll be able to toss out. Holy Priest, as an example, could do with those by buffing Holy Fire's dot damage, by buffing the damage out of Chastise, but then it comes into a problem of how do they deal with PvP. So there's a number of issues onto that one. Resto Shaman is a probably better example as well, where their single target DPS, if they're doing nothing else, is insanely strong. It's almost as good as a regular DPSer, right? In some cases, I think it might be better. And then you have that compared to if they're doing no damage and they're just putting a flame shock up and they're occasionally getting a lava burst out, they're not going to do near as much damage as one of the Disc Priests or Holy Paladins who's passively able to do damage without too much of a hindrance to their overall healing, right? There's a big disparity between those things, and when you chalk in damage reduction abilities on top of it, it just makes it even more in favor of them. So we don't need to necessarily attack every little thing, but there needs to be some sort of balancing act going forward in order to try to bring a little more of these things together. Your Heart of Azeroth, for example, is given extra stamina nodes. That's not only to help you with progression and make it easier for you to survive encounters, but it's also meant to counteract the healing power, your healer power creep over the expansion. Your ability to bring a health pool from 10% to 100% and how long it takes you to do that. End of Legion saw us able to top off health pools almost instantly. So it was a very big challenge to be able to have constant healing requirements to be able to make sure everybody survives. But when the enrage timers and when the DPS required for fights wasn't as high as it was in Eternal Palace, then you're a little bit less stressed about bringing only healers that bring defensive, high defensive cooldowns and externals, and bringing them the healers that have high passive DPS. It was less of an issue. It also had a number of 4 and 5 healer fights. When you look at Eternal Palace, there's a lot of 3 healer fights, and there's a lot of fights where you can get away with 3.5 DPS as well. A number of times where you can bring in a Battle Shaman, for example, have them DPS massive portion of the fight, and then they just come in to bring their cooldowns in as well. Yeah, it's a way to be able to make sure you assure that your raid spot is set up, but that's kind of no way to live as a healer. It's a little bit of a utility thing, but that's one thing that really can't exist in the next expansion, in my opinion. But talking about that class design, though, I know we've been getting a little off track on that end. But when we talk about class design, we haven't really seen a big picture of where they want to have these healers go. So that's where I wanted to kind of transition this from the raid side into the class side. What do they need to do to be able to make these fights more suitable for a wider variety of healers? So beyond just making sure that 4 and 5 healers are required, also looking at the class balance. Damage reduction cooldowns to start. For Disc Priest, yeah, it would feel bad if they did this, but I really think they need to move Barrier from being a raw damage reduction cooldown to being something to enhance atonement transfer rate. At this point, the raw damage reduction is just way too powerful, and while yes, it would turn it into a healing increase, it's a lot more restricted of a healing increase, and yes, it would show up on the meter, so you'd feel good about that, but you're also losing a little bit of the value from damage reduction. I think it'd be a fair buff for Mythic Plus, and while it would be a nerf for raids, it still would increase the value of Discipline by being able to have a stacking-centric tool to be able to top off players and deal with burst damage the way that they are more accustomed and used to doing. I would not be surprised if there's going to be some sort of damage reckoning for Discipline Priest. I think that their damage, along with that of Holy Paladins, is just ballooned out of control in a raiding environment. The amount of damage they're able to passively do while healing, in accordance with the Cyclotronic Blast Trinket, in accordance with Crucible of Flame, both abilities which are able to synergize with Schism, providing even more passive damage, more raw damage that they'll be able to pump out on raid encounters. It's honestly got out of control. It's really got out of control, and it will continue to do so if 8.3 doesn't make any sweeping changes like that. So it feels bad to say, but the Schism interaction for those 2 abilities needs to be removed. Barrier needs to have a significant drop in damage reduction or removed entirely and replaced with something along the lines of a bonus atonement transfer, which is what we had in Legion, in addition to the raw damage reduction that it provided, and something along the lines of lenience in the next expansion just should not exist. These tools, these resources that are available to it, having classes with some damage reduction and some classes without any at all, has just gotten to the point of ridiculousness, and these classes are not properly taxed or not properly attributed to the side benefits outside of the healing meter that they also provide. Holy Paladin as well. Not only do they provide absurd healing numbers based off of the Azerite trait Glimmer of Light, which in many cases has scaled so massively out of control, I'm shocked that it even exists now. Glimmer of Light was a very cool and useful ability, or useful trait in Dazar lore. It was very interesting and fun, and somehow they just let this thing scale massively out of control, even after some light nerfs, some light slaps on the wrist leading up to this tier. They did not properly understand how insane it would be, especially when in accordance with Devotion Aura. So now Devotion Aura giving that 20% damage reduction on a 3-minute cooldown, and also passive damage reduction to anybody who stands around them. I think it's what, 4 or 5 targets or something along those lines. It's split between those targets. Has just become so absurd. I am shocked and appalled that it has gotten this bad with Holy Paladin. The last time that I think people were stacking Holy Paladins this hard, it might have been Blackrock Foundry or something along those lines, maybe something earlier than that. And I don't think Paladin's been this out of control. It's very fun, it's very interesting to play, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't get out of control. And in the interest of that kind of healer balance, Devotion Aura needs to be looked at, maybe cut in half in terms of the raw value that it brings, maybe limited to a small radius around the player. Maybe both of those things might be able to be involved. And then next expansion, they need to look at those things as being on the chopping block. Bringing more equity to all of the healers, unless you're giving all the healers damage reduction cooldowns, which, hey, I'm in favor for. Or just start stripping them away from those classes and trying to balance out not only the raw HPS, which they work to do just about every tier, but also start balancing out the utility that's brought alongside of it. For classes like Rested Druid, for example, that because of how classes have become more and more homogenized over the expansions, what is very unique about Rested Druid these days? It's not that much more mobile than everybody else. No more moving Trank makes it quite a big issue, especially if there's a number of ground effects on boss fights, and they're just like every other lackey on that one. Yes, they're going to be able to have a bit more mobility than some of the other classes, but how much mobility is required to be healing a lot of the times? If you're not actively exercising that mobility, say in Antaurus you have a bridge fight, that makes it insanely good to have somebody who can constantly be healing everybody, especially when you're crossing that bridge and there's ticking damage, right? Amazing benefit. But if we're not seeing raid boss fights that synergize with your utility, then what good is it, you know? Same thing with Holy Priest. Holy Priest doesn't really have a niche. It can fit into a little bit of everything. So you often bring it as your 3rd, 4th, or 5th healer. Usually the 4th or 5th in many cases. Because it's not one of those classes that you absolutely need to bring, but it doesn't debilitate you in most cases. So looking at that as a source of, do we need to have some passive damage reduction given to Echo of Light? Does the passive damage from Holy Fire need to be scaled up? Does Chastise damage need to be scaled up? Where does Holy Priest bring an extra special benefit? You might say Symbol of Hope, but if people are able to kill raid bosses and if the healing is not tuned around bringing Symbol of Hope's extra 10 to 12% mana, then you're also going to be in a big bind there, right? What is special about something? What makes it worth bringing to a raid environment? That's a big question that needs to be answered for the next expansion. And I think the best thing that can be done right now is putting on some band-aid fixes to start bringing some of these classes a little bit closer together, or at least just requiring a lot of healers on fights, so that way you're actually seeing some decent representation. You're not seeing class stacking out the wazoo because you have to. It's very fun to be able to have encounters where healer damage is required. I personally love it. I know some people hate it and they just want to heal. Sorry, you should be able to do both, right? But in that same vein, when there's only a couple of healers on cutting edge progression that are able to bring that much damage, especially when you're only bringing 3 or 4 healers instead of the usual 4 or 5 healers, that's a problem. And maybe it brings into question the problem of Mythic the difficulty, the 20-man Mythic difficulty entirely. If it was 25 men, you bet there'd be enough damage to be able to service 4 or 5 healers, and if you were ever in a fight like 3, it was going to get fixed real quick before too many guilds would kill it. So in general, and in summation, these classes need to start having greater focus on what they bring, and it's a long time coming. I'm not the first one who said this. It's been one of the hottest topics of Legion's beta, was bringing in the utility of healers, what they bring to the table, and it was always a question. But in many cases it was suppressed because of the fact that many Legion raids would require 4 or 5 healers for these bosses. A couple of them didn't, but in general, there's enough healers required for encounters that you were able to more or less ignore the fact that some of them were massively better than others. Because you weren't the first pick for the raid, it wasn't that relevant because you were still the 4th or 5th pick and you got in anyway. Now we're not at that point, and now we're kind of past that point where we can deal with it, I think I would say. If we're having class stacking being as bad as it is, we can't deal with this anymore. And this needs to be something that is looked at, is addressed, and analyzed for its strengths. Because yes, while 1% shouldn't be the maximum focus of the balance, and that's a fair argument, it should also be considered as to what makes a class special, because that is eroded. And now, these days, damage reduction is special. Passive damage is special. And there's only a couple classes that bring that. And when you have a couple classes holding all the cards at the table, it feels bad. Whether it's Mythic Plus for the Rogues or Rested Druids. Or if it's raids and your Disc Priests and your Holy Paladins. No matter where it sits and where it stands, that's a problem that needs to be looked at. And being able to have communication on that end, that it is a problem, whether it will be solved in 8.3 or a 9.0, it should be addressed. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Let me know what you think. If their ideas are out there, radical, whatever. I want to know what you guys think. What do you think would be helping out that 8.3 healer meta? Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for being patient with more YouTube videos. I know I've been slacking hard. I love your faces, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch y'all next time.